Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil with weapons and strategy. Sometimes they happen in the corridors of military bases, where respect must be earned not through rank alone, but through character that shines brighter than any uniform. This is the story of Captain Sarah Martinez, a woman whose quiet dignity would teach an entire military installation that true honor cannot be measured by appearance, and that sometimes the most powerful salutes come from the most unexpected places. Captain Sarah Martinez stepped out of her weathered Honda Civic, the morning sun casting long shadows across the parking lot of Fort Henderson Army Base. The September air carried the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass and diesel fuel that every military installation seemed to share. She adjusted her service uniform, making sure every crease was sharp and every button properly aligned. After 15 years of military service, these small rituals had become second nature to her. The base was bustling with its usual morning activity. Soldiers in various uniforms walked briskly toward their assigned duties, their boots creating a rhythmic symphony against the concrete. Sarah had been stationed at Fort Henderson for only 3 weeks, having transferred from a deployment in Afghanistan where she had served as a logistics coordinator. The transition from combat zone to stateside duty was always challenging, but she approached each day with the same dedication that had earned her 2 Bronze Stars and the respect of her peers overseas. As she walked toward the main administrative building, Sarah noticed the mix of personnel around her. Young privates moved with nervous energy, their uniforms crisp and new. Seasoned sergeants carried themselves with the confidence that comes from years of experience. Officers of various ranks discussed morning briefings and training schedules. It was the familiar ecosystem of military life that had become her world. The administrative building was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, built in the 1940s when the base was first established. Inside, the hallways were lined with portraits of distinguished officers and displays showcasing the base's proud history. Sarah made her way to the 3rd floor where she was scheduled to meet with Colonel James Whitfield, the base commander, for her formal introduction and assignment briefing. Colonel Whitfield had a reputation that preceded him. At 58, he was a career military officer who had served in multiple deployments and commanded respect through his no-nonsense approach to leadership. His office walls were decorated with commendations, unit patches, and photographs from his various assignments around the world. He was known for running a tight ship and maintaining high standards for all personnel under his command. Sarah knocked on the heavy oak door marked with the colonel's name and rank. A gruff voice called out for her to enter. She stepped inside, immediately noting the office's formal atmosphere. The colonel sat behind a large mahogany desk, reviewing documents. Without looking up, he gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. After several minutes of silence, Colonel Whitfield finally raised his head to acknowledge his visitor. His steel-gray eyes immediately swept over Sarah's appearance, taking in every detail of her uniform and bearing. His expression shifted subtly, a slight frown creasing his weathered features. "Captain Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "I've reviewed your file. Impressive combat record, solid performance evaluations, strong recommendations from your previous commanders." He paused, setting down the folder containing her personnel records. "However, I have some concerns about your assignment here at Fort Henderson." Sarah maintained her professional composure, keeping her back straight and her eyes focused respectfully on the colonel. "Sir, I'm eager to contribute to the mission here and serve wherever I'm needed most effectively." The colonel leaned back in his chair, his gaze once again scrutinizing her appearance. "Captain, at Fort Henderson we maintain certain standards. This base hosts visiting dignitaries, congressional delegations, and international military attaches. The image we present reflects not just on this installation, but on the entire United States Army." He stood and walked around to the front of his desk, positioning himself directly in front of Sarah. "Your uniform, while technically regulation, lacks the sharp military bearing I expect from my officers. Your appearance suggests someone who might be more comfortable behind a desk than representing the professional excellence this base demands." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she maintained her military bearing. She had heard similar comments throughout her career, subtle and sometimes not so subtle suggestions that she didn't fit the traditional image of a military officer. Her uniform was meticulously maintained, her fitness scores exceeded standards, and her professional competence was documented in 15 years of exemplary service records. Colonel Whitfield continued, seemingly oblivious to the impact of his words. I'm assigning you to the supply depot coordination role. It's important work, but it will keep you primarily in administrative functions where your particular strengths can be best utilized. The implication was clear: he wanted her in a position where she would have minimal visibility and interaction with visitors or higher-ranking officials. Sir, my background includes extensive logistics coordination in combat environments. I believe I could contribute significantly to operational planning and field exercises, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the disappointment building within her. The colonel waved dismissively. Captain, sometimes we must serve where we're needed, not necessarily where we want to serve. Your assignment is to the supply depot, effective immediately. Major Thompson will brief you on your specific responsibilities. As Sarah left the colonel's office, she felt the familiar weight of disappointment that had accompanied many encounters throughout her military career. Despite her exemplary service record, her professional competence, and her dedication to the mission, she often found herself judged not by her capabilities but by preconceived notions about what a military officer should look like. The supply depot was located in a series of warehouses on the far side of the base, away from the main administrative and operational centers. It was important work, ensuring that all units had the equipment, materials, and supplies necessary for training and operations. However, Sarah recognized the assignment for what it was: a way to keep her competent butt out of sight. Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into her new responsibilities with characteristic dedication. She reorganized inventory systems, streamlined requisition processes, and identified several areas where efficiency could be improved. Her team of enlisted personnel quickly recognized her competence and began approaching her with suggestions and concerns they had harbored for months under previous leadership. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who managed the vehicle maintenance supplies, was particularly appreciative of Sarah's methodical approach. Ma'am, in 6 months we haven't had leadership that actually understood how the supply chain affects operational readiness. You've identified issues in 3 days that we've been dealing with for years. Despite finding satisfaction in improving operations, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her talents were being underutilized. She had coordinated complex logistics operations in Afghanistan, managing supply chains that directly impacted combat effectiveness and soldier safety. Her expertise in crisis management and resource allocation could benefit the entire base, but she had been relegated to a position that, while important, didn't fully utilize her capabilities. During her second week at the supply depot, Sarah received word that a joint training exercise was being planned involving multiple branches of the military. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Operations, and Marine Corps units would be participating in complex scenarios designed to test interoperability and coordination. The exercise would require extensive logistics coordination, precisely the type of operation where Sarah's experience would be invaluable. She requested a meeting with Major Thompson, her immediate supervisor, to discuss potential contributions to the exercise planning. Major Thompson, a competent but unimaginative officer who had held the same position for 4 years, was reluctant to rock the boat. Captain, the colonel has been very clear about your role here. We should focus on ensuring the supply depot operations run smoothly and support the exercise from our assigned function, Major Thompson explained, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Sarah persisted. Sir, my experience in Afghanistan included coordinating logistics for similar joint operations. I believe I could offer valuable insights for the planning committee. Major Thompson sighed, recognizing Sarah's competence but unwilling to challenge the colonel's decisions. I'll mention it to the colonel, but I wouldn't expect any changes to your current assignment. As the weeks passed, Sarah continued to excel in her assigned role while watching from a distance as preparations for the joint exercise proceeded. She observed inefficiencies in the planning process, coordination gaps between different units, and supply chain challenges that her experience had taught her to recognize and address. However, her input was neither sought nor welcomed by the exercise planning committee. The base buzzed with activity as the exercise date approached. Visiting units arrived daily, their personnel integrating with Fort Henderson's existing operations. Sarah watched elite military units conduct briefings and prepare for complex scenarios, knowing that her expertise could enhance their effectiveness but accepting that her role would remain limited to ensuring they had adequate supplies and equipment. It was during this period of intense preparation that Lieutenant Commander Jake "Torch" Morrison arrived at Fort Henderson. Morrison was a Navy SEAL with an exemplary service record and a reputation for excellence that preceded him. He had served multiple combat deployments and was known throughout the special operations community for his tactical expertise and leadership capabilities. Morrison's arrival went largely unnoticed by most base personnel, as he maintained the low profile typical of special operations personnel. However, his presence would soon create ripples that would fundamentally change the dynamics of Sarah's experience at Fort Henderson, setting the stage for events that would challenge Colonel Whitfield's assumptions and reveal the true measure of military character. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison arrived at Fort Henderson on a Tuesday morning, driving a nondescript rental car that belied his elite military status. Unlike the formal arrival ceremonies that sometimes accompanied high-ranking visitors, Morrison's entrance to the base was deliberately understated. Navy SEALs were trained to blend into any environment, and Morrison carried that philosophy into every aspect of his military service. At 34, Morrison had spent 12 years in the Navy, with the last 8 as a SEAL. His service record included deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and several classified operations that would never appear in official documentation. He had earned a Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart, though he rarely spoke about the actions that had led to those decorations. To those who knew him, Morrison was defined not by his awards but by his unwavering commitment to his fellow service members and his reputation for making the right decision under pressure. Morrison's assignment to Fort Henderson was temporary, part of his role in planning and executing the upcoming joint training exercise. His expertise in special operations and interagency coordination made him valuable for these complex scenarios that tested the military's ability to work seamlessly across different branches and specialties. After completing his initial check-in procedures, Morrison spent his first day familiarizing himself with Fort Henderson's layout and capabilities. He toured training facilities, reviewed base operations, and met with key personnel who would be involved in the exercise. His approach was characteristically thorough. He believed that understanding every aspect of an operation, from the strategic overview down to the smallest logistical details, was essential for success. It was during this familiarization process that Morrison first encountered systemic issues with the exercise planning. Communication between different units was fragmented, supply coordination was inefficient, and there appeared to be significant gaps in the logistics framework that would support the complex training scenarios. These weren't fatal flaws, but they were exactly the type of problems that could compromise the exercise's effectiveness and potentially create safety risks for participating personnel. Morrison had learned early in his SEAL career that the most dangerous oversight was the one that everyone assumed someone else was handling. In special operations, attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He approached the joint exercise planning with the same meticulous standards he applied to combat operations. During a planning meeting on his third day at Fort Henderson, Morrison raised concerns about logistics coordination. The meeting was held in a conference room in the main administrative building, with representatives from each participating unit present. Colonel Whitfield presided over the meeting, maintaining his characteristic authoritative presence. "Sir, I've reviewed the current logistics framework, and I believe we may have some vulnerabilities that could impact operational effectiveness," Morrison said, addressing the group but directing his comments primarily to Colonel Whitfield. The colonel's expression suggested mild irritation at having his planning questioned by a visiting officer. "Lieutenant Commander, our logistics personnel have extensive experience managing complex operations. Captain Martinez, who heads our supply coordination, has everything well in hand." Morrison noted the subtle dismissal in the colonel's tone but pressed forward professionally. "I'd like to review the coordination protocols with Captain Martinez to ensure seamless integration with special operations requirements. Our equipment and supply chains have some unique characteristics that need to be factored into the overall plan." Colonel Whitfield waved his hand dismissively. "Captain Martinez handles basic supply depot functions. For specialized requirements, you should coordinate directly with Major Thompson or my operations staff." The exchange revealed something that Morrison found troubling. Throughout his career, he had learned that the most competent officers were often those working quietly in roles that others might overlook. The colonel's casual dismissal of Captain Martinez suggested either a lack of awareness of her capabilities or, more concerning, a deliberate marginalization of a potentially valuable resource. After the meeting, Morrison decided to visit the supply depot personally. His approach to leadership had always been hands-on. He preferred to assess situations directly rather than rely solely on reports from others. The depot was located in a series of warehouses that bustled with activity as personnel prepared equipment and supplies for the upcoming exercise. Morrison was immediately struck by the organization and efficiency he observed. Equipment was meticulously arranged, inventory systems were clearly marked and updated, and personnel moved with purpose and precision. This level of organization didn't happen by accident, it reflected competent leadership and attention to detail. He found Captain Sarah Martinez in the main coordination office, reviewing supply requests on a computer while simultaneously coordinating with several staff members who approached her desk with questions and updates. Morrison observed her for several minutes before introducing himself, noting how she handled multiple complex issues simultaneously while maintaining a calm, professional demeanor. "Captain Martinez? I'm Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Navy SEALs. I'd like to discuss logistics coordination for the upcoming exercise." Sarah looked up from her computer, immediately recognizing Morrison's bearing as that of a special operations professional. "Lieutenant Commander, welcome to Fort Henderson. I'm happy to discuss any specific requirements you might have." Morrison spent the next hour reviewing supply chains, equipment specifications, and coordination protocols with Sarah. He quickly realized that she possessed exactly the type of expertise and experience that the exercise planning team desperately needed. Her questions were insightful, her suggestions were practical, and her understanding of complex logistics operations was evident in every aspect of their conversation. "Captain, your setup here is impressive. How long have you been managing depot operations?" Morrison asked. 3 weeks, sir. I transferred here from Afghanistan where I was coordinating logistics for forward operating bases. The challenges are different, but the principles remain the same. Morrison's respect for Sarah grew throughout their conversation. She had identified several potential issues with the current exercise planning that he had noticed but that apparently had been overlooked by the planning committee. Her solutions were creative, practical, and demonstrated deep understanding of how logistics coordination could enhance rather than simply support operational effectiveness. "Have you had the opportunity to provide input to the exercise planning committee?" Morrison inquired. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, revealing a hint of the frustration she had been professionally suppressing. "My role is primarily focused on supply depot coordination. The planning committee works through Major Thompson for logistics input." Morrison understood immediately. Sarah's expertise was being filtered through intermediate layers of command that might not fully appreciate or accurately convey her insights. It was a common problem in large organizations, valuable expertise trapped at levels where it couldn't effectively influence decision-making. Over the following days, Morrison made it a point to spend time at the supply depot, ostensibly to coordinate equipment requirements but actually to continue learning from Sarah's expertise. Their conversations revealed the depth of her experience and the quality of her strategic thinking. She had insights into interagency coordination, crisis management, and resource optimization that could significantly enhance the exercise's effectiveness. Morrison also began to notice how other personnel interacted with Sarah. The enlisted soldiers under her command clearly respected her competence and leadership. Visiting personnel who worked with the depot praised the efficiency and professionalism they encountered. However, interactions with higher-ranking officers were noticeably different, polite but distant, professional but lacking the genuine respect that Sarah's competence deserved. The contrast was particularly evident during a supply coordination meeting that Morrison attended. Sarah presented a comprehensive analysis of equipment distribution schedules, identifying potential bottlenecks and proposing solutions that would improve efficiency by nearly 30%. Her presentation was thorough, well-researched, and demonstrated exactly the type of strategic thinking that elite military operations required. Colonel Whitfield's response was perfunctory acknowledgement followed by delegation of implementation details to Major Thompson. Morrison watched the exchange with growing concern, recognizing that valuable expertise was being systematically underutilized. After the meeting, Morrison approached Sarah privately. "Captain, that was an excellent analysis. Have you considered presenting some of these insights directly to the Exercise Planning Committee?" Sarah's response revealed the careful professional balance she had learned to maintain throughout her career. "Lieutenant Commander, I appreciate the feedback. However, my current assignment focuses on supply depot coordination. Input to the planning committee goes through established channels." Morrison understood the subtext immediately. Sarah was diplomatically indicating that she had been excluded from higher-level planning discussions, not by accident but by design. Her competence was being contained within narrow boundaries that prevented her from contributing to her full potential. That evening, Morrison found himself reflecting on the dynamics he had observed at Fort Henderson. Throughout his military career, he had served alongside exceptional officers of all backgrounds, genders, and appearances. The special operations community was particularly merit-based. When lives depended on competence, superficial considerations became irrelevant. He had learned to recognize true military professionalism regardless of how it might be packaged. Morrison began to suspect that Sarah's marginalization was based on factors that had nothing to do with her military competence. He had seen similar patterns in other assignments: capable officers whose contributions were minimized due to conscious or unconscious biases that prevented leadership from recognizing their true potential. The realization troubled Morrison because it represented exactly the type of institutional dysfunction that could compromise military effectiveness. In special operations, team success depended on utilizing every available resource and capability. Artificial limitations based on appearance, background, or preconceived notions were not just unfair, they were tactically dangerous. Morrison decided to take action, but he knew that direct confrontation would likely be counterproductive. Colonel Whitfield was not the type of leader who would respond positively to having his decisions challenged publicly. Instead, Morrison began developing a more subtle approach that would demonstrate Sarah's value in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. His opportunity came during a routine review of exercise scenarios. Morrison identified several logistics challenges that had not been adequately addressed in the current planning. Rather than raising these issues in the general planning meetings, he requested a private consultation with Colonel Whitfield to discuss special operations requirements. "Sir, I've identified some potential vulnerabilities in our current logistics framework that could impact special operations effectiveness," Morrison explained during their meeting. "I believe we need more sophisticated coordination than our current structure provides." Colonel Whitfield's response was predictable. "Lieutenant Commander, Major Thompson and his team have extensive experience. What specific concerns do you have?" Morrison presented a carefully prepared analysis highlighting coordination gaps, communication inefficiencies, and resource allocation challenges. Each issue he raised was real and significant, and each one required exactly the type of expertise that Sarah possessed but that was being systematically excluded from the planning process. These are complex challenges that require someone with advanced logistics experience and proven crisis management capabilities, Morrison concluded. "Do you have personnel with that background available for consultation?" The colonel's dilemma was evident. Morrison had identified real problems that needed to be addressed, but the solutions required expertise that the current planning team lacked. Colonel Whitfield could not admit that his planning was inadequate, but he also could not ignore legitimate concerns raised by a respected special operations officer. Morrison had positioned the conversation perfectly. He was not challenging the colonel's authority directly, but he was creating a situation where Sarah's expertise would become essential for addressing legitimate operational requirements. The colonel would have to choose between maintaining his artificial restrictions on Sarah's role or acknowledging that her capabilities were needed for mission success. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just military hierarchy but fundamental questions about leadership, competence, and the true meaning of military professionalism. Morrison had learned that sometimes the most effective way to challenge institutional dysfunction was to force it into the open where it could no longer hide behind the comfortable assumptions that enabled it to persist. The morning briefing on Thursday brought together all senior personnel involved in the joint training exercise. The conference room was filled with officers representing different branches of the military, each bringing their unique expertise and perspectives to the complex planning process. The atmosphere was professional but tense, as several coordination issues had emerged that threatened to compromise the exercise's effectiveness. Colonel Whitfield entered the room with his characteristic authoritative presence, immediately commanding attention from all assembled personnel. His expression was serious as he reviewed the agenda for the morning's discussion. The exercise was scheduled to begin in just over a week, and several critical issues remained unresolved. "Gentlemen, ladies, we have some logistics challenges that need immediate attention," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison has identified several vulnerabilities in our current coordination framework that could impact operational effectiveness." Morrison stood to address the group, his demeanor calm and professional. He had spent the previous evening refining his presentation, ensuring that every point was backed by solid analysis and practical recommendations. His goal was not to embarrass anyone but to highlight problems that needed to be solved for the exercise to succeed. The primary issues center around communication protocols, equipment distribution timelines, and crisis response coordination, Morrison explained, using the large wall-mounted display to illustrate his points. "Our current structure has several single points of failure that could cascade into major operational disruptions." The assembled officers listened intently as Morrison detailed specific scenarios where coordination gaps could create problems. His analysis was thorough and professional, highlighting real vulnerabilities without assigning blame to any individual or unit. However, the implications were clear: the current planning was inadequate for the complexity of the exercise being attempted. Major Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Morrison's presentation continued. As the officer nominally responsible for logistics coordination, he was feeling increasingly exposed. His experience was primarily limited to routine base operations, and the multi-agency complexity of the joint exercise was beyond his expertise level. "These are valid concerns," acknowledged Captain Rebecca Hayes from the Air Force contingent. "Similar coordination challenges have caused significant problems in previous joint exercises. Do we have personnel with the specialized experience needed to address these issues?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Colonel Whitfield was clearly frustrated by the situation, but he was also trapped by the logic of Morrison's analysis. The problems were real, they needed to be solved, and the current leadership structure lacked the expertise to solve them effectively. "Major Thompson has been handling logistics coordination competently," the colonel replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Perhaps we can bring in additional resources from division headquarters." Morrison recognized his opportunity. "Sir, with respect, bringing in external resources might create additional coordination challenges and delays. In my experience, the most effective solutions usually come from identifying and utilizing existing expertise within the current structure." The statement was carefully crafted. Morrison was suggesting that the solution already existed at Fort Henderson, but he was allowing the colonel to save face by discovering that solution himself rather than being told about it directly. "What do you recommend, Lieutenant Commander?" asked Colonel Martinez from the Marine Corps contingent, genuinely interested in Morrison's perspective. Morrison had prepared for this moment carefully. "I recommend conducting a comprehensive capability assessment of all personnel involved in logistics operations. Often, we have expertise that we're not fully utilizing because it exists at levels where it's not immediately visible to senior leadership." The suggestion was logical and non-threatening, but it contained an implicit criticism of the current assignment structure. Morrison was diplomatically pointing out that competent people might be working in roles that didn't fully utilize their capabilities. Colonel Whitfield found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Morrison's analysis had identified real problems, his recommendations were sound, and other officers in the room were clearly taking his concerns seriously. The colonel's institutional instinct was to maintain control and defend his existing decisions, but his professional responsibilities demanded that he address legitimate operational concerns. "Very well," the colonel said after a long pause. "Major Thompson, I want you to conduct a review of all personnel involved in logistics operations. Identify anyone with advanced experience who might be able to contribute to solving these coordination challenges. Major Thompson nodded, though his expression suggested he understood exactly where this review would lead. He had worked closely enough with Sarah to recognize her capabilities, and he knew that any honest assessment would identify her as the most qualified person for addressing the challenges Morrison had outlined. The meeting concluded with assignments for follow-up actions, but Morrison sensed that the real decisions would be made in private conversations over the following days. He had successfully created a situation where Sarah's expertise would have to be acknowledged, but he knew that institutional resistance might still find ways to minimize her role. After the meeting, Morrison approached Major Thompson privately. His strategy was to provide Thompson with a face-saving way to recommend Sarah while positioning himself as supportive rather than challenging. "Major, I know this puts you in a difficult position," Morrison said. "If it would be helpful, I'd be happy to participate in the capability assessment. Sometimes an outside perspective can identify strengths that might not be immediately obvious to people working within the existing structure." Major Thompson was clearly relieved to have support for what he knew would be a politically sensitive recommendation. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant Commander. To be honest, Captain Martinez has extensive experience that might be relevant to these challenges. She coordinated logistics for forward operating bases in Afghanistan, including several multi-agency operations." Morrison nodded as if he were learning this information for the first time. "That sounds like exactly the type of background we need. Would it be possible to review her experience and qualifications?" Over the next 2 days, Major Thompson conducted his assessment with Morrison's assistance. The process was thorough and professional, examining personnel records, interviewing key staff members, and reviewing past performance evaluations. The results confirmed what Morrison already knew: Sarah was by far the most qualified person available for addressing the coordination challenges facing the exercise. Major Thompson's report was comprehensive and objective, documenting Sarah's experience, capabilities, and track record in terms that could not be disputed or dismissed. He had served under her leadership in Afghanistan, coordinated complex supply chains under combat conditions, and managed crisis situations that tested every aspect of her professional competence. The report also included testimonials from enlisted personnel who had worked under Sarah's leadership at Fort Henderson. Their comments were uniformly positive, highlighting her organizational skills, her ability to solve complex problems, and her talent for bringing out the best performance from her team members. When Major Thompson submitted his report to Colonel Whitfield, he included a carefully worded recommendation that Captain Martinez be given an expanded role in exercise coordination. The recommendation was framed in terms of operational necessity rather than personnel preferences, emphasizing the mission requirements that Sarah's expertise could address. Colonel Whitfield read the report in private, his frustration growing with each page. The document made it impossible to deny Sarah's qualifications or to justify continued limitations on her role. Morrison's analysis had created a situation where excluding Sarah from the planning process would be professionally indefensible. The colonel found himself confronting the uncomfortable reality that his initial assessment of Sarah had been wrong. Her competence was documented, her experience was relevant, and her exclusion from higher-level planning was starting to look like poor leadership rather than sound personnel management. However, Colonel Whitfield's institutional pride made it difficult for him to simply reverse his previous decisions. Admitting that he had misjudged Sarah would require acknowledging that his leadership had been flawed, a concession that his ego found difficult to accept. The colonel's dilemma was further complicated by the growing respect that other officers were showing for Morrison's analysis and recommendations. Morrison's reputation as a special operations professional gave weight to his assessments, and his diplomatic approach had made it difficult to dismiss his concerns as outside interference. On Friday afternoon, Colonel Whitfield called a meeting with Major Thompson and Morrison to discuss the capability assessment results. The meeting was held in the colonel's office, creating an intimate setting where sensitive personnel discussions could be conducted without broader visibility. "Major Thompson, I've reviewed your assessment report," the colonel began. "Your findings regarding Captain Martinez are interesting." Major Thompson maintained his professional composure, though he was clearly nervous about the colonel's reaction. "Sir, the assessment was conducted objectively, focusing on documented experience and demonstrated capabilities. Captain Martinez's background is particularly relevant to the coordination challenges we're facing. Colonel Whitfield turned to Morrison. Lieutenant Commander, what's your assessment of Captain Martinez's potential contribution to exercise planning? Morrison had prepared carefully for this moment, knowing that his response could determine whether Sarah would be given the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities or continue to be marginalized in a role that underutilized her talents. Sir, based on my review of her background and my observations of depot operations, I believe Captain Martinez has exactly the expertise we need for addressing our coordination challenges. Her experience in multi-agency operations and crisis management could be invaluable for ensuring exercise success. The colonel was silent for several minutes, weighing his options. He could continue to resist expanding Sarah's role, but doing so would require him to ignore objective assessments from two respected officers. Alternatively, he could acknowledge his misjudgment and allow Sarah to contribute to her full potential. Morrison sensed the colonel's internal struggle and decided to provide one final piece of leverage. Sir, given the complexity of this exercise and the number of visiting units involved, any coordination failures would likely receive significant attention from higher headquarters. Ensuring we have our best personnel in key positions seems like the most prudent approach. The implication was subtle but clear. If the exercise failed due to coordination problems, and it was later discovered that qualified personnel had been excluded from planning roles, the colonel's leadership decisions would face scrutiny from his superiors. Colonel Whitfield finally spoke, his voice reflecting reluctant acceptance of the situation. Very well. Captain Martinez will be assigned to the Exercise Planning Committee as Logistics Coordination Specialist. Major Thompson, arrange for her to be briefed on all current planning and coordination requirements. Morrison felt a sense of satisfaction at the breakthrough, but he also knew that Sarah would now face the challenge of performing under intense scrutiny. The colonel's decision was based on operational necessity rather than genuine recognition of her capabilities, and any mistakes or problems would likely be attributed to his decision to expand her role. The stage was set for Sarah to demonstrate her true capabilities in a high-stakes environment where success would validate Morrison's confidence in her abilities, while failure would confirm the colonel's initial prejudices. The upcoming exercise would test not just military coordination but also fundamental questions about leadership, competence, and the courage required to challenge institutional assumptions. Sarah received notification of her assignment to the Exercise Planning Committee on Friday evening, just as she was completing her daily review of depot operations. The message, delivered by Major Thompson personally, carried the weight of opportunity mixed with the pressure of intense scrutiny. Captain, effective immediately you're assigned as Logistics Coordination Specialist for the Joint Exercise Planning Committee, Major Thompson explained. The colonel wants you fully briefed on all current planning and ready to participate in Monday's coordination meeting. Sarah felt a surge of excitement tempered by professional caution. This was the opportunity she had hoped for since arriving at Fort Henderson, but she understood that her performance would be closely watched by leadership who had initially questioned her capabilities. Sir, I'll need to review all existing coordination protocols and identify current planning status, Sarah replied. Will I have access to the complete planning documentation over the weekend? Major Thompson nodded. Everything will be available to you. Lieutenant Commander Morrison specifically requested that you receive comprehensive briefings on special operations requirements as well. Over the weekend, Sarah immersed herself in exercise documentation with the focused intensity that had characterized her entire military career. The planning materials revealed the scope and complexity of the upcoming exercise. Multiple service branches, special operations units, conventional forces, and civilian agencies would participate in scenarios designed to test interoperability under realistic conditions. As Sarah studied the existing plans, she began to identify the coordination gaps and vulnerabilities that Morrison had highlighted in his analysis. Communication protocols were fragmented, supply chain management was inefficient, and crisis response procedures lacked the integration necessary for complex multi-agency operations. However, Sarah also saw opportunities for improvement that went beyond simply fixing existing problems. Her experience coordinating logistics in Afghanistan had taught her to think systematically about resource optimization, communication integration, and adaptive planning that could respond to changing conditions. By Sunday evening, Sarah had developed a comprehensive analysis of the current planning along with detailed recommendations for addressing identified vulnerabilities. Her approach was characteristically thorough. She had examined every aspect of the operation from strategic overview down to tactical implementation details. Monday morning's planning committee meeting brought together all senior personnel involved in exercise coordination. The conference room was filled with officers representing different branches and specialties, creating a professional atmosphere charged with the urgency of final preparations. Colonel Whitfield opened the meeting with a brief introduction of Sarah's expanded role. Captain Martinez has been assigned as Logistics Coordination Specialist to address the operational challenges we discussed last week. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, would you please review the specific areas where additional expertise is needed? Morrison provided a concise summary of the coordination vulnerabilities he had identified, setting the stage for Sarah's presentation. His remarks were professional and supportive, creating a framework for Sarah to demonstrate her capabilities without appearing to challenge existing planning authority. Sarah stood to address the group, her bearing reflecting the confidence that came from thorough preparation and extensive experience. She had prepared her presentation carefully, focusing on practical solutions rather than criticism of existing approaches. I've reviewed the current coordination framework and identified several opportunities for improvement that will enhance operational effectiveness while reducing risk, Sarah began. My recommendations focus on integration, communication, and adaptive response capabilities. Using detailed charts and analysis, Sarah walked the committee through her assessment of current planning. Her presentation was systematic and professional, highlighting both strengths and vulnerabilities in terms that demonstrated deep understanding of complex military operations. The primary vulnerability is our communication structure, Sarah explained. Currently, different units are using separate protocols that create information silos. In dynamic situations, this fragmentation can delay critical decision-making and compromise coordinated responses. Sarah's analysis was thorough and insightful, revealing coordination challenges that had been overlooked by the existing planning team. Her recommendations were practical and implementable, drawing on proven techniques from combat operations where communication failures could have life-or-death consequences. Captain Hayes from the Air Force contingent was the first to respond. These communication integration recommendations align with lessons learned from our recent joint exercises. How quickly could these protocols be implemented? Sarah's response demonstrated both technical competence and realistic planning capabilities. The communication integration can be implemented within 48 hours using existing equipment and personnel. The key is establishing clear hierarchies and backup procedures that automatically engage when primary systems experience problems. Colonel Martinez from the Marine Corps asked about crisis response procedures. What happens when the original plan encounters unexpected developments? How do these coordination improvements help with adaptive planning? Sarah had anticipated this question, drawing on her experience managing logistics under rapidly changing combat conditions. The framework includes decision-making protocols that allow local commanders to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining overall coordination. Each unit retains tactical flexibility while ensuring strategic coherence. As the discussion continued, it became evident that Sarah possessed exactly the expertise the exercise needed. Her recommendations addressed every major vulnerability Morrison had identified, and her solutions were based on proven techniques rather than theoretical approaches. Morrison watched the discussion with growing satisfaction. Sarah's performance was validating his confidence in her capabilities, and the other officers were clearly recognizing her competence. The committee was beginning to function as it should have from the beginning, with the most qualified personnel contributing to their full potential. Colonel Whitfield's expression during the meeting was difficult to read. He was clearly impressed by Sarah's presentation and the positive response from other committee members, but his pride was struggling with the implications of her competence. Sarah's excellence highlighted the inadequacy of his initial assessment and assignment decisions. After Sarah concluded her presentation, the committee spent another hour discussing implementation details and coordination procedures. Sarah answered questions with confidence and provided additional insights that demonstrated her deep understanding of military operations. By the meeting's end, the consensus was clear: her recommendation should be implemented immediately. Following the meeting, several officers approached Sarah individually to express appreciation for her analysis and to discuss specific aspects of her recommendations. The response was uniformly positive, reflecting professional respect for expertise delivered competently and professionally. Morrison lingered after the other officers had left, wanting to provide Sarah with feedback on her presentation. Outstanding work, Captain. Your analysis addressed every major concern and provided practical solutions. This is exactly what the exercise needed. Sarah appreciated the feedback but remained focused on the work ahead. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. The real test will be implementation and execution. These coordination improvements need to function under pressure. Over the following days, Sarah worked intensively with different unit representatives to implement her recommended improvements. The process required diplomacy as well as technical competence, since she needed to modify existing procedures without undermining the authority of officers who had developed the original plans. Sarah's approach was characteristically professional. She framed her recommendations as enhancements rather than corrections, giving credit to existing planning while introducing improvements that would increase effectiveness. Her diplomatic skills proved as valuable as her technical expertise, allowing her to build consensus around changes that might otherwise have faced resistance. The implementation process also provided opportunities for Sarah to work directly with personnel from different military branches. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Operations, and Marine Corps units all had unique requirements and procedures that needed to be integrated into the overall coordination framework. Morrison was particularly impressed by Sarah's ability to adapt her coordination approach to the specific needs of special operations units. She understood that elite units required flexibility and autonomy while still needing to integrate with conventional forces for logistical support and strategic coordination. Most logistics officers think special operations just needs different equipment, Morrison observed during one of their coordination sessions. You understand that we need different processes and decision-making structures as well. Sarah's response reflected her comprehensive understanding of military operations. Special operations succeed because of rapid adaptation and decentralized decision-making. The logistics framework needs to support those capabilities rather than constrain them. As the exercise date approached, the improved coordination protocols were tested through rehearsals and simulations. The results validated Sarah's analysis and recommendations. Communication was more effective, resource allocation was more efficient, and crisis response capabilities were significantly enhanced. The success of these improvements was particularly evident during a complex simulation that tested the coordination framework under high-stress conditions. Units from different branches worked together seamlessly, adapting to changing scenarios while maintaining overall mission coherence. Colonel Whitfield observed these rehearsals with mixed emotions. He was pleased that the exercise was proceeding smoothly and that potential problems had been identified and addressed. However, he was also confronting the uncomfortable reality that his initial assessment of Sarah had been fundamentally wrong. The colonel found himself in the position of watching an officer he had marginalized demonstrate exactly the capabilities he had failed to recognize. Sarah's competence was now evident to everyone involved in exercise planning, and her contributions were being praised by visiting officers whose opinions carried significant weight. Morrison noticed the colonel's discomfort and recognized the leadership challenge it represented. Military hierarchy depended on the ability of senior officers to make sound personnel decisions, but it also required the flexibility to acknowledge mistakes and adapt to new information. The evening before the exercise was scheduled to begin, Morrison made a decision that would test both his own courage and the colonel's character. He requested a private meeting with Colonel Whitfield to discuss a matter that could not be addressed through normal military channels. "Sir, I wanted to speak with you about Captain Martinez's performance during the planning process," Morrison began, his tone respectful but serious. "Her contributions have been exceptional, and I believe her capabilities have broader implications for personnel management at Fort Henderson." Colonel Whitfield's expression suggested he knew where the conversation was heading, but Morrison pressed forward diplomatically. "In the special operations community, we've learned that the most dangerous assumption is thinking we know someone's capabilities based on first impressions. Captain Martinez is exactly the type of officer who makes units more effective, and I believe she deserves recognition for her contributions to this exercise's success." The conversation was carefully structured as professional feedback rather than personal criticism, but its implications were clear. Morrison was suggesting that the colonel's initial personnel decisions had been flawed and that Sarah's marginalization had been based on factors unrelated to her military competence. The colonel's response would determine not just Sarah's future opportunities at Fort Henderson, but also whether the institutional changes needed for true military excellence could overcome the personal pride and institutional inertia that often prevented organizations from recognizing and correcting their mistakes. The stage was set for the final test, not just of the exercise coordination that Sarah had developed, but of the character and leadership that would determine whether competence would be rewarded or whether institutional barriers would continue to limit the contributions of capable personnel whose appearance didn't match traditional expectations. The joint training exercise commenced at dawn on Tuesday with the precision and intensity that characterized elite military operations. Multiple units moved simultaneously across Fort Henderson's training areas, implementing complex scenarios designed to test every aspect of interagency coordination and tactical cooperation. Sarah positioned herself in the main coordination center, a converted warehouse that had been equipped with communication systems linking all participating units. Banks of monitors displayed real-time information about unit positions, resource status, and operational developments. The coordination center was the nerve center of the entire exercise, where information flowed together and decisions were made that would determine the success or failure of the complex operation. From the first hour of the exercise, Sarah's coordination improvements proved their value. Communication between different units was seamless, resource allocation responded dynamically to changing requirements, and crisis response protocols functioned exactly as designed. The fragmented communication structure that had plagued earlier planning was replaced by integrated systems that allowed rapid information sharing and coordinated decision-making. Colonel Whitfield observed the exercise operations from an elevated platform in the coordination center, watching as his base hosted one of the most complex training scenarios ever conducted at Fort Henderson. The presence of visiting officers from higher headquarters, including a general from Joint Operations Command, added pressure to ensure that everything proceeded flawlessly. Morrison led his SEAL team through a particularly challenging scenario that required coordination with Army Rangers, Air Force support, and conventional forces. The operation tested every aspect of the coordination framework Sarah had developed, creating exactly the type of high-stress environment where communication failures and logistics problems typically emerged. However, the coordination system performed excellently. When Morrison's team encountered an unexpected obstacle that required immediate resupply and tactical support, the response was rapid and effective. Within minutes, Army Rangers had repositioned to provide covering fire, Air Force assets had been redirected to provide reconnaissance, and supply personnel had delivered exactly the equipment needed to continue the mission. Outstanding coordination, Morrison reported over the communication system. Request was processed and executed in under 4 minutes. This is special operations level efficiency. The comment was heard throughout the coordination center, including by the visiting general who was monitoring exercise progress. General Patterson, a career officer with extensive joint operations experience, immediately recognized the significance of Morrison's assessment. Special operations personnel were notoriously difficult to impress, and their praise carried particular weight in evaluating coordination effectiveness. As the exercise progressed through increasingly complex scenarios, Sarah's coordination system continued to demonstrate its effectiveness. Units adapted seamlessly to changing conditions, resources were allocated efficiently, and communication remained clear despite the high-stress environment. Major Thompson, observing from the coordination center, turned to one of the visiting officers. 6 months ago, coordination exercises like this typically experienced multiple communication failures and resource delays. Captain Martinez's framework has eliminated those vulnerabilities. The visiting officer, Colonel Anderson from Division Headquarters, noted the comment with interest. What was different about Captain Martinez's approach compared to previous coordination systems? Major Thompson's response reflected his growing appreciation for Sarah's expertise. She designed the system based on combat experience rather than training manual theory. Every protocol was tested under actual operational conditions in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the exercise scenarios continued to increase in complexity. A simulated crisis situation was introduced that required immediate coordination between all participating units while adapting to rapidly changing intelligence and evolving threats. This was exactly the type of scenario where coordination systems typically broke down under pressure. Sarah managed the crisis coordination with calm professionalism, implementing adaptive protocols that allowed units to respond flexibly while maintaining overall mission coherence. Her experience managing similar situations in combat environments proved invaluable for maintaining effectiveness under pressure. Morrison's team was directly involved in the crisis scenario, and he had a front-row seat for observing how Sarah's coordination system performed under maximum stress. The response was flawless, information flowed smoothly, decisions were made rapidly, and units adapted their actions seamlessly based on real-time intelligence updates. This is the most effective coordination I've experienced in 15 years of joint operations, Morrison reported during a brief lull in the action. The system is performing better under stress than most coordination frameworks perform under optimal conditions. General Patterson was taking detailed notes on exercise performance, and Morrison's assessment was clearly making an impression. The general had participated in numerous joint exercises throughout his career, and he understood the significance of achieving seamless coordination between different military branches and specialties. As the exercise entered its final phase, a complex scenario was implemented that tested every capability that had been developed during the planning process. Multiple units operated simultaneously across different areas, communication systems were pushed to their limits, and resource allocation requirements changed dynamically based on evolving mission parameters. Sarah coordinated this final scenario with the same professional competence she had demonstrated throughout the exercise. Her system handled the complexity effortlessly, maintaining situational awareness and coordinated response even as scenarios became increasingly challenging. Colonel Whitfield watched Sarah's performance with growing admiration mixed with uncomfortable recognition of his earlier misjudgment. Her competence was undeniable, her coordination system was clearly superior to previous approaches, and her leadership under pressure demonstrated exactly the qualities that distinguished exceptional military officers. The exercise concluded with a comprehensive after-action review attended by all participating personnel. General Patterson presided over the review, analyzing performance metrics and gathering feedback from unit commanders about coordination effectiveness. This exercise demonstrated the highest level of interagency coordination I've observed in recent joint operations, General Patterson announced to the assembled personnel. Communication was excellent, resource allocation was efficient, and adaptive response capabilities exceeded expectations. The general paused, consulting his notes before continuing. I'm particularly interested in the logistics coordination framework that was implemented for this exercise. The performance improvements compared to previous operations are remarkable. Morrison stood to address the group. Sir, the coordination framework was developed by Captain Sarah Martinez, who drew on extensive combat experience to design systems that perform effectively under high-stress conditions. General Patterson's attention focused immediately on Sarah. Captain Martinez, would you please explain the key elements of your coordination approach? Sarah rose to address the general and the assembled personnel, maintaining her characteristic professional bearing despite the significance of the moment. This was her opportunity to demonstrate her expertise to the highest-ranking officer present, and she approached it with the same methodical preparation that had characterized all of her work. Sir, the framework prioritizes integration over isolation, adaptive response over rigid procedures, and decentralized execution within centralized planning, Sarah explained. Each element was designed based on lessons learned from combat operations where coordination failures have serious consequences. General Patterson asked several detailed questions about specific aspects of the coordination system, and Sarah's responses demonstrated both technical competence and strategic understanding. Her analysis was comprehensive and insightful, revealing the depth of thought that had gone into developing the system. Outstanding work, Captain, General Patterson concluded. This coordination framework should be evaluated for implementation across Joint Operations Command. Are you available for temporary assignment to help develop training protocols for other installations? The question represented exactly the type of recognition that Sarah's competence deserved, but it also created a moment of intense scrutiny for Colonel Whitfield. The general was essentially asking to borrow one of his officers because her capabilities had impressed him during the exercise demonstration. Colonel Whitfield found himself facing a defining moment of his leadership. He could support Sarah's advancement and acknowledge her exceptional capabilities, or he could find reasons to resist sharing her expertise with higher headquarters. His decision would reflect not just on his assessment of Sarah, but on his character as a military leader. "General, Captain Martinez has been an asset to Fort Henderson since her arrival," Colonel Whitfield replied. "We would be honored to support Joint Operations Command with her expertise." The response represented a complete transformation from the colonel's initial assessment of Sarah's capabilities and potential contributions. Morrison observed this exchange with satisfaction, recognizing that institutional change was possible when leadership demonstrated the courage to acknowledge mistakes and adapt to new information. Following the after-action review, General Patterson approached Sarah privately to discuss the temporary assignment opportunity. "Captain, your coordination framework addresses several challenges we've been experiencing across multiple installations. Would you be interested in developing training protocols that could be implemented throughout Joint Operations Command?" Sarah's response reflected both professional excitement and appropriate humility. "Sir, I would be honored to contribute to improving joint operations effectiveness. The techniques I used here can definitely be adapted for different operational environments." As news of Sarah's recognition spread throughout Fort Henderson, the response from personnel who had worked with her was overwhelmingly positive. The enlisted soldiers in the supply depot expressed pride in their commander's achievement, and visiting officers who had participated in the exercise praised her professionalism and expertise. Morrison approached Sarah as the day's activities were concluding, wanting to provide personal congratulations on her success. "Captain, that was an exceptional demonstration of military leadership. Your coordination system didn't just work, it excelled under pressure." Sarah appreciated Morrison's support throughout the process, recognizing that his advocacy had been crucial for creating the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities. "Lieutenant Commander, your analysis of coordination vulnerabilities provided the framework for improvement. This success belongs to the entire team." Morrison's response reflected his understanding of military leadership and the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its packaging. "Captain, throughout my military career I've learned that the most dangerous assumption is thinking we know someone's capabilities based on superficial assessments. Your performance this week demonstrated exactly why merit-based evaluation is essential for military effectiveness." That evening, Colonel Whitfield requested a private meeting with Sarah in his office. The same office where he had initially assigned her to supply depot coordination based on his assessment that she lacked the bearing for more visible responsibilities. "Captain Martinez, I owe you an apology," the colonel began, his tone reflecting genuine humility rather than forced courtesy. "My initial assessment of your capabilities was wrong, and my assignment decisions failed to utilize your expertise effectively." Sarah maintained her professional bearing, responding with the same dignity she had demonstrated throughout her marginalization at Fort Henderson. "Sir, I appreciate your acknowledgement. My focus has always been on contributing to mission success regardless of assignment." Colonel Whitfield continued, demonstrating the character required for genuine leadership. "Your performance during this exercise has been exceptional, and General Patterson's recognition reflects the quality of military professionalism that Fort Henderson should be promoting. I intend to recommend you for early promotion and ensure that your future assignments fully utilize your capabilities." The conversation represented complete vindication for Sarah's competence and Morrison's advocacy. However, more importantly, it demonstrated that institutional change was possible when leadership demonstrated the courage to acknowledge mistakes and prioritize mission effectiveness over personal pride. As Sarah left the colonel's office, she reflected on the events that had transformed her experience at Fort Henderson. The exercise had provided an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities, but the real victory was the recognition that military excellence could triumph over institutional prejudices when supported by courageous leadership. Morrison's final assessment, delivered during his departure briefing, summarized the broader implications of the week's events. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies but against internal assumptions that prevent us from recognizing the excellence that exists within our own ranks. Captain Martinez's performance this week demonstrated that true military professionalism transcends superficial judgments and that our effectiveness depends on utilizing every available capability. The salute that Morrison rendered to Sarah as he departed Fort Henderson was witnessed by numerous base personnel, including Colonel Whitfield. It was a gesture of professional respect between military equals, acknowledging competence that had overcome institutional barriers through excellence demonstrated under pressure. Sarah's story at Fort Henderson became a powerful reminder that military effectiveness depends on recognizing and utilizing capabilities regardless of their packaging, and that the courage to challenge assumptions is essential for maintaining the excellence that military service demands. The colonel's transformation from skeptical supervisor to supportive advocate demonstrated that leadership growth is possible when character proves stronger than pride.